Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about HR-based provisioning for our identities. Now ordinarily I think about Active Directory domain services, I'll just call this AD, and Azure AD. Now if I think about those two systems, I'm a hybrid environment, so I have my Active Directory domain services environment, and then we have our Azure AD, identity provider. And remember, the big deal here is that with our regular on-premises Active Directory domain services, we think of LDAP and Kerberos and those types of interactions. Whereas with Azure Active Directory, we speak cloud. OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, SAML. And when I have these two systems, Active Directory domain services, it is considered the source of truth. And what I mean by that is the flow of information is from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. Now that flow of information can be done in one of two ways. Traditionally, we think about, well, hey, I have Azure AD Connect. So I have AAD Connect. That synchronization engine is something I run on a Windows virtual machine, or it could be a physical box. And I have connector spaces for my Active Directory, a connector space for my Azure Active Directory represents those objects. There's a metaverse in the middle that brings it all together. But the flow is this. Now, there are a few things that will sync back around Exchange, password write back, but really it's all flowing that way. I create objects in Active Directory, and then they appear in Azure Active Directory. My other option I can do now is there's Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. So now that engine is running in the cloud. Now, to facilitate the communication with my domain controllers, which obviously still has to happen, what I have in this model is I have some provisioning agents. And while with Azure AD Connect there's one active instance, I can have a standby as well. With provisioning agents, we want multiple of them. Typically, we talk about 3 for resiliency purposes. So now I have these provisioning agents, again, running on Windows Server virtual machines. And what they're going to do is they establish a connection to the Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. And then what they actually do is they pull the instructions they're given via talking to a service bus, and there are SCIM requests written, say, hey, go and do these things, which it then converts to LDAP and does the work. But fundamentally, the flow is still that way. It's still Active Directory is that source of truth. And so we're used to this idea. But the reality is, there's actually another system that is probably the enterprise source of truth, that is that system of record when I think about identities. And that system is your HR system. So very probably we have some HR system. And this, when I think about human beings, this is the true system of record. This is the ultimate truth in terms of, hey, who is working with the company? What department are they in? Who is their manager? What is their leave date? What is their start date? So this is actually what ideally I would think about, that rather than, hey, me getting an email or some request that I then go and manually create the user here, then it goes and syncs up to the Azure AD, to have the most current and up-to-date information, really I'd like to trigger off of this. And when I think about these HR systems, right now I'm talking about Workday, for example, or SAP SuccessFactors. They're some of the two big HR systems that we think about for this interaction. And when I think about this HR and the system of record, and I think about a user, there are a few key details that we obviously think. Obviously, there's a name. That's very obvious. But we'd also think about, well, what department are they in? Because their department would then go and drive what access they have, what applications they have, and what roles they might have. They're going to have a certain manager. The manager, hey, they get added to some maybe distribution list. It might drive other things. But in terms of our identity and making sure they're valid, we also have things like, well, a join, date and time, and then ultimately a leave, date and time. And there are going to be other attributes as well, but there's some really important ones. Now, in another video, I talked about Azure AD lifecycle workflows, and they were all based around the idea that, well, hey, for that joiner leaver scenario, based on sort of the join and the leave dates, we can trigger things. I can trigger things a few days before they join, maybe generate a temporary access pass and email it to the manager, who can then talk to the user so they can onboard. Maybe on the day they join, they get sent a welcome email. 7 days before they leave, maybe they get added to some network of people who used to work at the company. On the day they leave, hey, their account gets disabled, etc. And so for these attributes, if I think about the users, obviously remember the user account in our hybrid world starts in AD and it gets synchronized up and I get my Azure AD account and I get all those other attributes. But the two important ones we have right here, I have this idea of an employee hire date, and I also have the idea of that employee leave date time. And when I think about this flow and what I want to happen, I want to make sure these are included, because I'm going to think about this as a complete system. Yes, this HR connection is going to let me drive creating accounts and keeping them up to date as the manager changes, the department changes. But I'd like to use those lifecycle workflows as well. So I want to make sure these joiner leaver times flow through. Now, in a cloud-only model, if I don't have this piece, it's easy. These attributes just exist. Hey, I just sync them to it. And that's what I'll show a little bit later on. But if I do have the hybrid scenario, then I need to synchronize these, remember, to Active Directory domain services, because it is what then will feed Azure AD. Now, there is no employee hire date or employee leave date time in Active Directory domain services. So what we would do in this scenario is there's actually a couple of options. There are these extension attributes. If I have the Exchange schema applied to my Active Directory, then I will see these extension attributes. So for example, maybe I've got extension attribute 1, and obviously then I'd have extension attribute 2. There are also some cloud ones. These were added in Windows Server 2012, designed for cloud applications. These are the MSDS cloud extension attributes, and I think it's 1 through, I'm not actually sure. So if we actually have a look, be a good way to see this. So this is my domain controller, and here it looks like it's 1 through 20. So if we zoom in for a second over here, I could use these. So maybe I don't have the extension attributes, or maybe I'm using them for other things. Hey, I could maybe use extension attribute 1 for my hire, and extension attribute 2 for my leave, or I could use 10 and 11. Whatever I'm going to pick, I could synchronize those to extension attributes in my Active Directory. So don't worry if, hey, I'm doing the hybrid and I start to worry about these. What I will think about when I'm doing my synchronization, I will feed these are going to flow into custom attributes. And then if I am in that hybrid world, what I'll do as part of my either Azure AD Connect rules or my Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, both of them are going to work. What I'll actually do is I'll add some sync rules, and it will just say, hey, employee hire date, the source is extension attribute 1 or that MSDS cloud extension attribute 1. Employee leave date time, hey, that is sourced from extension attribute 2 or MSDS cloud extension attribute 2. So I add some sync rules, which again will now populate those. So just consider those as part of my flow because I want to be able to take advantage of this all up complete flow of everything. Now, another thing to bear in mind is I'm never limited just to things like lifecycle workflows. Remember, there's already really powerful capabilities in Azure AD that if someone has attributes changing, well, I could modify group membership. So one of the key things I'll want to take advantage up here is dynamic groups. So I create some separate dynamic groups. And what I could do is, for example, I might have, hey, a dynamic group based on the attribute department. So when they join and they have a department set, they would get added to any groups that say if, hey, department attribute equals this. If they change department, well, that would update. They'd get removed from the old groups and added to the new groups. Maybe it's location. Hey, I get added to this group that gives me building access. Manager, so their distribution list. And the whole point here is once I'm in dynamic groups, those dynamic groups can be granted access to applications. They can be granted access to different roles. They can be granted access to RBAC, permissions to access various resources. And you're not limited to just maybe native Azure AD. Remember, also sitting out there in the world, you have all of these other SaaS applications, all of these other SaaS workloads that you have, and you've configured to trust your Azure AD. Well, now once I get all of these things put together with my HR system, these SaaS solutions will now be using that HR-driven data. So that's the key and the goal around what we want to do. So don't think, hey, I'm just doing lifecycle workflows or I'm just doing HR. You take advantage of everything. You think of the complete solution. So dynamic groups are still hugely powerful here because as I get these updates, I can drive so much off group memberships. Sounds great. How? How am I creating this mystical connection between Azure AD, cloud only or hybrid, and my HR system? Well, it's actually really, really easy. If we jump over to the portal, I'm using Entra, but the regular just portal.azure.com would work as well. If we go to our applications and enterprise applications, so remember, I'm looking down here. And again, this is the same in the regular portal. If I'm in my all apps, if I hit new application, if I search for Workday, now you're going to see 4 key answers here. Now, when I think about this, the first one where it just says Workday, this is just regular single sign-on to the Workday application. It's going to use SAML to give me the authentication to Workday based on my Azure AD tokens. And I'm showing Workday, but I have exactly the same thing if I was doing SuccessFactors. So you're going to see those same 4 key options. Hey, just the first one, SAP SuccessFactors, that would give me single sign-on. You'll then see a write back, and then you'll see a Azure AD user provisioning and an Active Directory user provisioning. So obviously the Active Directory will be in that hybrid environment. But I'm going to pivot back to Workday because that's the one I have configured, and we see exactly the same options. Hey, single sign-on, write back. So the write back scenarios are, hey, maybe there are certain IT-driven attributes that I actually want to go back into my HR system. Maybe once they get created in Active Directory or Azure AD, the email attribute set. Well, I would like that in the HR system. So the write back lets me have things flowing in the other direction. And then we have that same, hey, Azure AD user provisioning. If I'm cloud only, then also we have the Active Directory user provisioning. Now, I may be hybrid, but I may have different groups of users. Maybe some of them may be consultants. I only want in Azure AD. So I may actually use just the Azure AD option for maybe my consultants, but then regular employees, I want them in AD and Azure AD. So you have a choice. You might actually use both of those, because I can use scoping filters to control which objects are provisioned, are synchronized across. Now, the way this is going to work is I drew this idea of the Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync before. Well, Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync is actually part of a larger service. There's this bigger service that is the Azure AD Identity Provisioning Service. So that is just one of them. But another very big one, well, I guess I'll draw it here. There is a HR provisioning service. And obviously that's the one we're going to focus on here. And the way this works is the HR provisioning service will establish an outbound connection. So this is our connection to our HR system. But then what it's actually going to do is it's going to pull the data. So it's not being pushed from the HR system. It's creating the connection. It's going to look. So look, who's been joining, who's changed things, who's leaving. So it is going to go and then pull that. So that's being enabled through one of those two, the Active Directory user provisioning or the Azure AD user provisioning. Now at this point, it depends on, is it cloud only or is it hybrid? If it is just cloud only, i.e. it's hybrid, well then it just sends it up. And I'm done. Because it's an Azure AD service, it can just automatically go and synchronize to Azure AD. Now, if I'm hybrid, it has to be able to talk to our domain controllers, because remember the flow of source of truth between AD and Azure AD. The object is coming from HR, but if I have hybrid, it can't just write to Azure AD because it would never sync back. So if it's coming from HR, even though it's this cloud service, it needs to create the object in Active Directory domain services, which will then synchronize it using the normal means to Azure Active Directory. To do this, it uses the provisioning agents. Now, if I'm already using Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, I already have the provisioning agents. I don't have to do anything else. If I'm using Azure AD Connect, I don't have the provisioning agents. So I would need to go and deploy the provisioning agents. Again, these should be separate boxes. They need line of sight to the domain controllers. They shouldn't run on the domain controllers. I could put them on my Azure AD Connect box. But the whole point here is now that the HR provisioning system will now talk to the provisioning agents. Now, once again, the flow here is actually, well, the provisioning agents really create a connection this way. It's the same service bus. It's the same service bus, and it's looking for these SCIM, the System for Cross-Identity Management requests, which it services. It converts them to LDAP requests to actually do things against my domain controllers. So once again, it's looking and it's pulling those SCIM requests, and then it will actually go and do those updates by LDAP, write, etc. And then it will just synchronize the regular way. Either it will go and synchronize because I'm using Cloud Sync, or it can use Azure AD Connect. It doesn't matter, but that's the flow if I'm hybrid. So that HR provisioning system has to get it created in AD. So it talks to the provisioning agents. It's really the provisioning agents are looking at this service bus, looking for those skim requests. It goes and actions them, creates updates, deletes the objects in AD, and then there's nothing special. It's just whatever flow I have to talk from AD to Azure AD, be it Azure AD Connect or my Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. All of that just works the same way. So that's, through one way or another, has now got the objects into Azure Active Directory. And remember, what we now have then is our user with department attribute, location attributes, employee hire date, employee leave date, time. And that lets me, from a complete perspective, cover the entire joiner, mover, leaver. Because if I think about these things all put together, well, obviously one of the things I can do here is the employee hire date, time. Well, these trigger my Azure AD lifecycle workflows. They run a series of tasks based on, hey, you're 3 days before your employee hire date. Hey, create the tab, email it to your manager. Hey, it's your hire date, do this. Hey, it's 7 days before your leave date. Whatever that is, I'm doing that. Also, hey, you're joining your department, you should add them to these dynamic groups. Hey, you're leaving, you're no longer got this attribute, I should remove you from these groups. So when you combine the employee hire and the leave date time with dynamic groups and other features, these all together cover joiner and leaver scenarios. Now, lifecycle workflows today don't really cover mover. I am changing department, I'm changing location, but these do. So the dynamic group part, these cover mover scenarios. So when I use all of this together, it's really powerful. And I'm not having to manually do anything. The key point here is that once I've set up, for example, these dynamic groups, once I've set up these Azure AD lifecycle workflows, once I get this connection to the HR system, which is super easy to do, it's all just going to flow and happen for me really automatically. And once again, it's not just Azure AD and Office and Azure. All of your third-party SaaS applications that you've integrated with Azure AD, they'll get all of the same rich, up-to-date HR-based data that they can leverage as well. So let's see it a little bit. So if we jump back over to the portal, if I actually go and look at my applications, and remember the whole point, just show this one more time. If I search for Workday, I need, and again, the same thing would happen for SuccessFactors, I need either the Azure AD user provisioning or I need the Active Directory user provisioning. Now, in my example, I'm just doing cloud only. So I add this application. Once you add that application, so I already went ahead and added it. So here I've got my Workday to Azure AD user provisioning. And what I would then do is I would go to provisioning. I have to give it an account that has permissions in Workday. So if I go to my provisioning tab, I've already done the admin credentials. And then I do mappings. So I want to provision Workday workers. Yes. This is going to look super familiar if you did Azure AD Connect cross-tenant sync. So Azure AD cross-tenant sync. I have the mappings of the attributes. So over here I have my Workday attributes. And then what, in this case, Azure AD, but remember if it was the AD, it would be the AD attributes that it maps to. And all of these were just there by default. Now you can see key ones. Well, I can see department. I could see things like state. Maybe I'm doing things based on the state. I can see my name. I can see the manager attribute. But then I went ahead and I added, so these were not there by default, I added employee hire date and employee leave date time. So what I'm mapping from here is in Workday, there was a status hire date, and I've mapped that to employee hire date. And then there was status termination date. I have mapped that to employee leave date time. So those are two I added because I wanted those to be able to then go and trigger my Azure AD lifecycle workflows. But you can go and add new ones. And it will just show me, hey, the source attributes, these are all the things I could get from Workday. And then what I want to write it to in Azure AD. So I can go and add whatever ones I want. Now, something else to pay attention to here is the idea of I can also control when am I doing things. So I've got it for create, update, and deletes, but also notice I can add a scope. So currently it's set to all records, but I could change this to say, do you know what? I only want to provision records that, I don't know, maybe there's an employee type was permanent. Maybe I've got a different thing for consulting. Whatever I want to do, I could add scoping filters. So it's not just every single user that ever gets created. I can limit to what that's going to do. So I can add in that scoping as well. And then once I've done all of those mappings, I would come in and turn on provisioning status to on. So that will make it happen automatically. And then once I click this provisioning status to on, in the overview page, I would just hit the start provisioning button. Now I've not done that because I want to be able to control it. And instead what I'm going to use is this option of provision on demand. And I just wanted to show this actually in action. Now what provision on demand lets me do is pick specific users. Now right now in my Azure Active Directory, I have Oliver Queen. So we can see I'm looking right now at Felicity Smoke. And Felicity Smoke's manager is Oliver Queen. Now I've already synchronized that one over. And for Felicity Smoke, if I look at job details, I can see the employee ID. So this is what I'm going to need, 21679. But it's also notice a hire date is in the future. So I've got this attribute. Now this does not currently exist in Azure AD. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in that employee ID and hit provision. It is now going to go and talk to Workday, and it's going to go and grab that user and notice modified attributes that were successful. So we can see all of the things that they have pulled over, including, notice my employee hire date, pulled from the status hire date, so I've got this record created. It has also taken things like the manager, so that's referencing the Azure AD object for Oliver Queen. And I can see it's gone and created a user principal name is now a saviltech.net, so it's modified that to be a regular user. And if I look at the data flow, I can see, hey, all of the flow of each of the attributes. I can see the exact detail of that. And if I jump back over just to prove that actually happened, what I should now see, hopefully, is Felicity Smoke. There we go. And if I look at Felicity Smoke and I look at the properties, what we can see for Felicity Smoke is, sure enough, that manager attribute flowed over and is even linked to the Azure AD object, but also I have employee hire date, which means all of my goodness around Azure AD lifecycle workflows would then trigger. My dynamic groups would all be triggering based on the job title, based on department, based on all of those other things would all now kick in. Now, if I'm curious about exactly what's happening here, if I go back for a second to that Workday, we have these really nice provisioning logs. So if I look at provisioning logs, I can see the detail of everything that's happening. Let's try and refresh that. Why is that not working? I'm going to change that quick. Let's just maybe, if I can get some of my older ones. So the newer one is not showing just yet. Not quite sure why. But this is the one I did a couple of days ago. And we can see the full step. So I can always go back and look at all of the detail. So notice here, hey, it's importing the user. It's checking, are they in the scope? If I had those scope options set. It's matching, is there an existing user? And then it's showing me all of the attributes. So I can go back at any time and get all of the detail around this. And the one I just did will show up at some point. Not quite sure why that's lagging right now. But I can always go and get all of that detail. Probably within a few minutes, this will show up. But that's it. I mean, it's super simple to set up, but it's so powerful once you have it set up. Now do remember, for the Azure AD Lifecycle Workflows, that's an Azure AD P2 feature to have that. Just the provisioning via HR, that's a P1 feature. And most likely, if you're an organization that's got a HR system, you're having these richer enterprise environments, you're at least going to have P1 for all your users anyway. But that was it. I hope this was interesting. Hopefully you see how simple it is, but how powerful the complete solution becomes. And as always, till the next video, take care. Now it shows up.